First of all, thank you to CA and ANZ for hosting this today. As I think you've already heard, a lot of important and complex issues at play in this space, and certainly we as the regulator are very conscious of the need to debate those issues and to acknowledge that most of them don't have any easy resolution. And the interplay of standards and regulatory oversight and perception really do make this an area that is worthy of some proper discussion. And in particular, I think worthy of a discussion away from a crisis. As you may have seen in how we in the Reserve Bank tried to respond to some of what was being said and discussed at the Australian Royal Commission into financial services, experience tells us that if you wait for a crisis to have a conversation about complex issues, you'll end up being overtaken. And certainly, as you heard, I think in the UK, both the regulator and profession have been overtaken by events. They've failed to shape the conversation, and they're failing to shape the outcomes, and I suspect that's not a good thing. So without beating around the bush, I think it's important for us and for everyone in this room to remind people that of the role that we think audit plays, specifically in contributing to market integrity and informed investor decision making. That's what the FMA's legislative mandate directs us to, and we do think that audit quality sits at the heart of that mandate. It speaks to and it influences investor confidence, efficient markets, to good governance and culture within firms, and also within the audit firms themselves and the companies that commission audit reviews. So if we want to develop participation in New Zealand's financial markets and we want to have a thriving financial services sector, then the investors, whether that's large or small investors, professional or retail, they need to be able to rely on audited information. Not surprisingly, we are also focused on the quality of the oversight regime and what that's supposed to deliver, as we are responsible for supervising the supervisors. And our aim, obviously, it goes without saying, is to support and improve the quality and integrity of the audit profession. So that's the aspiration that we have and the value that we consider that audit brings. Why we did the survey was really driven by a couple of things. One, our perception actually that with auditors and regulators of audit taking a pasting in other jurisdictions, it would be remiss of us not to actually take a deeper look here. As I've said to a couple of people, I was also very conscious that one of the criticisms levied at the Financial Reporting Council in the UK was that they hadn't done much to actually prompt the debate of some of the issues that we're trying to talk about today, and acknowledge that they're difficult issues without simple solutions. And by failing to sort of lead some thought in that space, unfortunately, when they got overtaken by events, their views were no longer relevant, quite frankly. And so we decided to commission a survey to test our own view about where audit quality sits and the perceptions of audit quality, and our sense that within the profession as a whole, and I'm talking both globally and locally, there was a bit of complacency around perceptions of what audit brings. And so the research that we shared, I think, with all of you last week, and if you don't have it, let me or one of the team know, and we'll give you that. It really does show that expectation gap between what investors want as the end users, if you like, of audit services, and what they currently believe the industry is delivering. So I'll talk about the results in a minute, but as a headline, and we have released that survey to the media, so there'll be a bunch of sessions with journalists this afternoon, I think. The headline is that we think that overall audit quality and confidence in the sector is okay, but those serious expectation gaps need to be dealt with. We can't just leave the lack of understanding about the value that audit brings and the role that audit plays. We can't leave it where it currently is. And so whilst we might look at other jurisdictions, in particular in this case the UK, and take the view that we're in better health, there is a gap and it needs to be filled. So one of the things that we have discussed, and when we look at this situation overseas and here, is that one of the words that's missing from a lot of the discussion around audit is the word assurance and all of that entails. Particularly when you think about who that assurance is supposed to be being given to, and that piece I talked about investor confidence participating in our markets. So one of the UK shareholder groups, as part of the debates in the UK, was quoted as saying that previously when they voted for or against audit selection, they were based on whether the audit firm was seen as being appropriately independent from the company that was appointing them. That they're now at a stage where demonstrable failure by some firms is becoming a reason to oppose their appointment, and bad audit firms should fail. And you look at why some of the investor groups in the UK are so hacked off, and it was quite interesting, some of the reports there about preventing corporate collapse. When you look at Carillion, which obviously a lot of people have been tarred by that particular brush, one of the UK press quotes, and I'll read the quote, really rams home why people are focused on corporate collapse and the role of the auditors. The auditors earning around £1.5 million a year for vouching that Carillion's accounts gave a true and fair view of its business were in fact rubber stamping figures that misrepresented the reality of the business. In March 2017, the firm expressed no concern over reported profits of £150 million, even though just 4 months later these proved to be illusory. So in the UK, I think historic indifferences between auditors and shareholders has actually morphed into a real crisis of mistrust, and the UK is not the only place. We talked a little bit about the US. You don't have to roll it back that far to look at those fundamental shifts in the audit profession and what was required of it. And in Australia, I spent last week in Australia, I think it's fair to say there's not a lot of faith and confidence in the audit, the quality of audit over there at the moment. We talked about the Kingman review, we talked about the CMA review, talked about the Bryden review. I agree with what's been said. That looks like a huge shake-up is coming, and I think that's going to be really quite transformative. So we see issues overseas, like we did with the banks and the insurers, that could threaten, or possibly are already threatening to become major issues here. And so they may land in a smaller scale here, they may not. So against that backdrop, there's a clear opportunity here for the industry and the regulators to get ahead of the crisis, to look at the issues and show some leadership, to talk to stakeholders and investors about what it is they want from audit and what audit is actually supposed to deliver. Because if we do get a major loss of confidence here in both audit quality and the regulation of audit, that can only be a bad thing for what are, as you heard already, thin capital markets. So my role here is not to criticise the industry and point any more fingers than I absolutely need to. It's about laying down the challenge to fill that gap in expectations that you saw quite starkly there, and you see very starkly in our research, which I would remind you focused on investors rather than members of the public. So we can help at the FMA promote awareness and understanding of the value that audit brings and what audit does and does not do. But at the end of the day, it's not our job to promote what should be in your own interest as an industry to encourage confidence in the profession. You can build that bridge with the investor community and the wider public. It may not yet be broken, but if it does break, as I say, it will be difficult actually for this group to react in a constructive way. So just quickly then, the results of the survey. We surveyed retail and institutional investors, we surveyed directors and members of audit and risk committees, we surveyed managers of reporting entities themselves, and obviously we surveyed the audit profession. And we wanted to test the level of trust and respect for the audit profession and indeed understanding of it, and whether the current oversight regime that we run and the regulatory system are understood. So as you will have seen from the survey, what we found was overall a reasonable level of confidence. I think that's a good basis to work from, but a clear expectation gap between what investors thought audit firms both should be and are delivering, and what the audit firms themselves think. And you heard earlier about the impact of corporate collapses, both on public sentiment and investor sentiment. We saw that very clearly in the results of our survey. I think it's worth pointing out that just over half of investors said they trusted audit, and less than half thought the quality of auditors in New Zealand was of a high standard. In terms of the trust issue, directors, not surprisingly, were somewhere in the middle, with auditors marking themselves rather well. And there is some logic to that. We heard about that earlier. If you're closer to the process, you're going to have a better understanding and probably a better confidence in it than someone who's further away. And I would suspect that depending on how you phrase that question to the public, you could quite easily lead the public to the very extreme end of that particular spectrum. A lot of investors question the value of audit to them, i.e. what's it bringing to them, and some investors even think that the regulation of audit should increase. So I'm going to run that on a democratic basis, but it's interesting, I think some of them thought that. Directors and members of audit and risk committees were reasonably positive, but I think it is notable that only just over half of those agree with the statement that auditors challenge management sufficiently, and that's something the FMA often focuses our time on. And just under half felt that they got good value from an audit, with some saying that they thought the fees were too high for the value that gets delivered. When it comes to ethics and acting independently, auditors rated themselves, I think by memory, 98%, whereas only 56% of investors agreed with that. So I think that ought to be a bit of a wake-up call. So I think if you try and summarise the survey, you can probably look at some of the results in two halves. There's some very broad questions and brushstrokes around issues in the industry, whereas I would remind you, we also did, or had the survey firm do quite detailed interviews with a number of participants, and that gave us actually some real nuance and feedback in order to come up with a more nuanced picture. So whilst we can see the impact, and we heard the impact of a bunch of issues in some of New Zealand's sort of major businesses, the headline businesses, you think of Fonterra, Fletcher Building, you think of CBL and Wynyard, all very different circumstances in those cases, and the audit firm's role in those would have been very different throughout. But obviously they've had an impact. But on the positive side, I think we have seen firms go down in New Zealand. I think about Pumpkin Patch, where actually our perception of the FMA is we didn't get a lot of questions about the role of the auditors, and actually people understood that there was a business model that just hadn't panned out, and in fact that the finger pointing that New Zealand seems to enjoy was less prevalent there than we might have expected. So I think that's actually a positive step, and it does suggest that there are some cases of business failure that can happen here without everyone calling for public executions. But as I've said a couple of times in this piece, that there is a serious gap between what the investors think is being delivered or should be being delivered and what the profession thinks, including in whether you can trust audit and whether there's appropriate ethical standards. So the expectation gap that I think a lot of today is all about is significant. It's writ large in all of our interviews, all of the survey responses. You can see that. And I think for any profession, if the end users, and by that I mean the people who rely most significantly on your product, don't see the full value or are expecting something that you're not delivering, then you have a problem. Again, the in-depth interviews put that into some better degree of context, and I think that divergence was qualified somewhat by the people we spoke to in depth. But nonetheless, you think about public perception, and particularly in a crisis, how that gets away from us. I think that we shouldn't be too comforted by the fact that all of us in this room can see the nuance, because the reality is that people outside of this room appear not to be able to. I think also the industry itself has commented, including today, that it may not have done a great job promoting itself, the value that it brings to end users, and the extent to which it's robustly supervised both within the firms and outside the firms. And so we need to demonstrate the joined up relationship between the regulator here and the profession and the oversight bodies and the disciplinary functions and how that all fits together, because our view is that that's missing amongst a lot of the investor population, including some of the institutional investors, I would add. So there's been a bit of a failure of communication here. I mentioned to a couple of people this morning that I think one of the challenges of audit is that it's a bit of a black box. And then when you read a set of financial statements or you read a company report, actually it's not clear usually exactly what the audit firm is supposed to be doing and what it has done. And I think that lack of clarity, I think, is a problem. That research and our own research, the research that Zoe talked about and our research actually reflects that certainly investors and most stakeholders want more from audit. If they actually understand what the constraints are, what the limitations are of an audit process, what you're going to find is even if they acknowledge that, they want more. And that's something I think the industry, the standard setters, the regulators need to think quite hard about, which is, well, is that actually a realistic direction to go in? And if it is, what should it look like? We get a lot of questions around, including sometimes ourselves, but attendance of auditors at annual general meetings. Whilst I acknowledge, I think that's an extremely difficult situation to put an auditor into. I do wonder whether some of the black box nature of what audit is there for and isn't there for, and the split between what the auditor is responsible for and what the company management and board are responsible for, I do wonder whether that's something that we should respond to. So we need, as a regulator, to explain better what we do and what we don't do, and I think the audit profession needs to do the same. So just to conclude on the lessons from overseas and how we think we might take this forward here, one of the comments in the Australian Royal Commission about misconduct within the big Australian financial services firms was that that's the sort of behaviour that goes unnoticed, particularly when no one is actively looking for it. And I would say to you, that's obviously one of the roles of an audit process, and it's certainly the perception of one of the roles of an audit process. So that level of assurance that people can take from an audit of financial statements needs to be right back on everyone's radars. And actually in the Royal Commission, one of the comments that was made, and it's a very long report, but one of the comments that was made about auditors was that actually in some cases auditors had raised issues around processes and risk management and governance in some of those financial services firms. Those comments were somewhat ignored by management and boards of those firms, and the audit firms didn't follow up rigorously to make sure that they were taken into account. So I think taking the narrow view of what audit brings as being limited to the review of financial statements probably doesn't match public expectations of actually what audit should be delivering. And so relying on the information in audit accounts does mean that there's some trust as to the level of assurance that's been provided that those figures, valuations, estimates, liabilities, you name it, are more than reasonable and appropriate, that they're actually backed up with solid evidence and board assurance and management assurance that directors and the audit and risk committee have actually done the work that they're supposed to do in order to allow the audit firm to be at its best. And in the US, we've seen some heavy prices paid for audit firms that haven't followed up with sufficiently rigor. But I think the challenge to the business models now outside the US is just as acute. So I'll finish by saying we absolutely understand, and I think all of you understand, that no one's going to solve these questions overnight. And indeed, some of the solutions may come from outside of this jurisdiction, and there won't be much we can do about it. But a lot of these issues are extremely complicated. But we do have to keep bringing the profession and the stakeholders back to some of the values that we ask about in audit quality reviews and that we looked at in our survey. So that's professional skepticism, independence, reliability and clarity of financial statements, and robust selection of auditors. So that's not to say we overlook the role of regulation and oversight. We at the FMA, and I think the point was made earlier, we need to avoid forcing the profession into a tick box sort of compliance mentality. We absolutely understand that one of the values of audit is the judgment that is applied to difficult issues. But that judgment needs to be applied in an environment where we can see how it's been applied and we can be comfortable that it's been applied appropriately. So all of those will be ingredients that build trust in audits and in the audit profession, but they have to be modelled by the profession, they have to be talked about, they have to be communicated. We have seen in audit overseas and more recently here around the work we did on banks and insurers that the tide can turn quite quickly once people perceive there's a gap in regulatory frameworks and oversight. On the banks and insurance work, the government has actually responded incredibly quickly in consulting on what will be really far-reaching changes in the regulation of financial services. And you've all seen what's happened in the UK, so let's not get left behind. So I'll finish again by making the statement that we have made every time we've talked about audit quality, and I'll be reinforcing this afternoon, which is that we think the quality of audit in New Zealand is at an acceptable level. We think confidence in the audit profession is okay, but when you look at that expectation gap and you put it against the prospect of a major collapse or some major issue happening here, then the discussions that you see happening in Australia and the UK will happen here very, very quickly. So I think if we can all get ahead of those sorts of discussions and get on the same page about how to take audit forward, I think it will serve us well come the crisis. So I think I'll leave it there, Murray. Hand over to the
Thank you.
next person.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you for that.